Okay, hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is a teeny tiny review because everybody's forgot they're having a quiz tomorrow. So, welcome. So this one on behavior, the first big part that I would ask you questions about on your quiz is having examples between behavior being having a genetic basis or through learning. Just a second. Sorry, it's frozen on here. Okay, there we go. So when we looked at examples for a genetic basis of inheritance, if you remember, we looked at the lovebirds and we looked at the intermediate. Remember, the lovebirds had different ways of carrying nesting material, some long and carried it in their beak, and some were short and carried it in their rump feathers, and the intermediate cut intermediate length. Actually, the hybrid kind of acted like a hybrid, and it would put them in his rump and then it would fall out. So that was evidence for a genetic basis of inheritance.
Wait, so this length of strips were genetic, but learning how to carry them for the middle one?
Okay, so let me clarify that. So the idea was how much of our behavior is in our DNA and how much of our behavior is learned. So this would be evidence. This is one that is used for the evidence that it is in our DNA, because one species of lovebird would cut long lengths and carry them in their beak. Mm-hmm. The other species would cut short lengths and tuck them into their tail feathers. Mm-hmm. So the intermediate, the hybrid, didn't cut long, it didn't cut short, it cut intermediate. Okay. And it did want to tuck it in its tail feathers, but it did learn that it kept dropping them. But the key thing here is that this would be an example of a genetic basis because it cut an intermediate length. Okay, then the next one we looked at were these garter snakes and their food preference. And some preferred slugs and some didn't prefer slugs. So they were wondering, is that genetic, or did they learn to like slugs? You know, what happened there? Well, it turns out it has to do with the number of tongue flicks. So that's in their DNA, how often they flick their tongue. Because when they flick their tongue, they're tasting the air. So the hybrid had an intermediate affinity for slugs. It didn't absolutely like it like one of its parents, but it didn't absolutely ignore it like the other parent. It had an intermediate affinity because it now has an intermediate number of tongue flicks. Again, behavior in DNA. We also looked at studies with twins and similarities in twins and that behavior then in the DNA. And we looked at Aplysia, a slug, and even if it hadn't mated, it would go through a very complex egg-laying procedure as long as it got that hormone. So if the gene is there for that hormone, it will have that behavior. Or if the gene is there that creates the hormone, then it will have that behavior because they injected it right in. And then we looked at that nurturing gene. And the nurturing gene for mice, if they had it, then they would take care of their offspring if they wandered off and hover over them. But if they didn't have that gene, they wouldn't have the behavior that we would consider mothering. Yes?
In the textbook, it mentions like the endocrine system and the nervous system, so this would be an example of the endocrine system. Endocrine
system, exactly, yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was the first thing. And then we went in and we talked a little bit about fixed action patterns. And these can be very complex behaviors. Things like building a web or building a nest. And people thought scientists thought maybe that was learned, but it's a pattern. This step triggers this step, triggers this step, triggers this step. There's not any learning involved. That is a fixed action pattern. But some things that they thought were fixed action patterns actually had some learning involved in it. And the example that we looked at, things like pecking and trying to get the parents to regurgitate and give them food. They got better at the pecking, and so as a result of that, they got more food. They learned, if I do this, I get more food. We looked at other examples of learning, like imprinting. There are certain times when bless you. Birds will recognize their parents their female parent here after they're hatched. They'll imprint on their face or their eyes, and then they will follow that parent wherever they go. if a substitute parent is in their face, that will become the parent that they follow. And we talked about Lorenz and his goslings, because he did what the mother was supposed to do, so they learned, oh, that is parent. We also talked about habituation, where animals learn when to be afraid and not to be afraid, when to attack and when not to attack. You could talk about animals in the zoo, or animals that are never hunted, maybe in a park. They know not to be afraid, and animals in a zoo know they can't attack and win. We also talked about song learning in birds, and that overall, in a nutshell, there is some social interaction to help them learn that song. They will mimic that parent, but as long as they have some sort of tutor, they can learn the song they need. Okay, so now we have a bunch of examples of genetic basis of inheritance, and now we have several examples for learning. And then we went a little bit farther, and we talked about specifically associative learning. So associating one thing with another. And we gave two examples. One was classical conditioning, and this was Pavlov's dog. And they associated the ringing of a bell with food is sure to come, and so they would start salivating. Maybe you have a dog and it knows where the leash is, and when you go there, it starts hopping around. That would be classical conditioning. Keep in mind, with classical conditioning, the stimulus comes first, and then that type of behavior. Okay, and then we looked at Skinner. Okay, and this is called operant conditioning. And here they perform the operation first, whatever it is. They perform the task, and then they either get a reward or they get a punishment. So if you remember that one, operant conditioning, think they have to do this operation first, then it's followed up. This could still be applied to dogs, like we learned with dog training, right? You roll over, then I'll give you a treat. Okay, that would be operant conditioning. Okay, and we also learned about observation and imitation. These babies learn to wash potatoes before they eat because they watch their mother wash potatoes before they eat, and so they learn that particular behavior. And then last we talked about aha moments, and that would be insight, having insight. So it's something you've never done before, but you've taken your past experience and applied it. And in this case, we talked about crows and how they were able to get at the meat that was hanging from a string by pulling the string up and stepping on it with their foot, and pulling up the string again and stepping on it with their foot till it was close enough for them to eat. Okay? And that would be insight. We then went into behavioral ecology, and we're looking at how natural selection is going to favor or shape certain behaviors. And this is back to behaviors that are genetic, and they can be selected for. It's in your DNA or it's not in your DNA. And one of those we looked at was the whole sexual selection area, and this is if the females are doing the choosing. And if females are choosing who they're mating for, there's two hypotheses about who they choose. The good gene hypothesis says, I'm going to pick an organism that's strong, that has access to the most food, that runs the fastest. That would be the good gene hypothesis. The runaway hypothesis would be about some trait they're running away with, like a peacock, or a bird that it's brightly colored with plumage, big feathers, and they have that, maybe it's a giant mane on a lion, and they just look, but actually, anyway, that's another whole thing. They're looking for something, and this would be for us, this would be somebody who's good looking, would be the runaway hypothesis, where the good gene hypothesis would be somebody who has a lot of what? Money. Now back to the lions. Lions work a little bit differently, because remember we talked about interselection and intra-selection? So lions, they're going to fight amongst themselves, okay? And when they're fighting amongst themselves, that's intrasexual selection. Joe Lion will compete with Jim Lion, or in this case elephants, for the right to control a territory or a group of females. Okay, so when you have males competing and you get a pecking order, okay, that's intrasexual selection. Males are competing with other males.
Because doesn't intra mean
Within, so male with other male, because they're the same, okay? Whereas intersexual selection, that's like Betty choosing Joe, either because of the good gene hypothesis or the runaway hypothesis. So this is about female choice, and this is about male control. See the difference?
Yes.
Female choice versus males controlling. In intersexual selection, there's usually the male that's going to control that area and the females that are within it. And we looked at some different examples. Okay, in intersexual selection, here's some pretty males doing a dance, doing something to attract her attention that she wants, what she's looking for. And here in intrasexual selection, they're competing or fighting in order to control the females. And when they're controlling that territory, they could do it, you know, with a call. They could do it by marking their territories, and that would be part of that communication aspect that we talked about later. We did bring up dominance hierarchies, and that when you are the alpha male, when you do that intersexual selection and you win, and you are that male, and you get that ranking through a series of confrontations, your drawbacks are you usually require more food because you're bigger and you're defending, and you put yourself in danger because if you're controlling that area, if another male wants to control that area, they're going to challenge you. And it could be somebody that's within your group or somebody outside of your group maybe is going to challenge you for that particular position. So you put yourself in danger. I'm going fast. Are you okay? I'm just kind of powering through it. Plus I'm recording it. So you're all recorded as well. All right, and then that brings us to, and then we can go through and do all the clicker questions that you want to do. Okay? Whatever ones you want to do. Okay, and then we're at sociobiology, and this is when organisms are living together, and there are upsides to living together and downsides to living together. The upsides would be that there are more hands on deck to do work, more eyes on the crowd to watch out for your team. You can delegate different jobs, like helping to raise young. You can work together to achieve whatever goals you want. You can share the load. The downside of living together is it can be very crowded, and so as a result, you could want the same things, so there'll be disagreements. You have fewer overall young because you usually only have a few breeding pairs within that area. Or there's one mating pair, and because you're not high in the pecking order, you don't get to have sex with anybody. And also when you're living closer together, you're more likely to spread parasites. Okay. We talked about sociobiology. We talked about the meerkats, and we talked about this idea of altruism. And altruism, by definition, would be, you're sacrificing your fitness, your ability to pass on your genes in order to allow somebody else to survive. You're sacrificing yourself for others.
So it's like 100% sacrifice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And what does altruism actually exist? No, probably not. Okay, because when they're making their sacrifice, there's a reason why they're making that sacrifice. What?
They want to be.
Yeah, what's the benefit when a soldier meerkat stands on the hill and he screams when there's a predatory bird coming? What's the benefit that he will ultimately receive? Protecting his offspring, yeah. And that's a form of direct selection. And so when we look at fitness, it's your ability to pass on your genes. And so direct selection, you're looking at you are surviving or your offspring are surviving. That is direct selection, yourself or your children. Indirect selection are any of your kin, your relatives. So, for instance, when ants are living in a colony, they're all related. So they're doing it for the good of their genes since they share the same genes. And so that is one form. Here, where chimps, when they see one of their brothers, they're not actual brothers, but close to, their relatives having sex, they won't interfere because they are closely related, so they're getting their genes passed on. And so that would be an example of kin selection. Now, there is something called reciprocal altruism, which is basically I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. So I'll clean the parasites off you if you clean the parasites off me. And I get the added benefit of a tasty little treat. So when we looked at these vampire bats, then they will regurgitate part of their meal, so they're not going to be as strong the next day because they've given up some of the blood meal they got that night, and they're giving it up to a neighbor that's in their pod, in their cave, and all that neighbor had to do was lick its face. But the benefit, reciprocal altruism, it's not really altruistic, right, because you get something back in return, but that's just what it's called. The benefit of that is if you need food, all you have to do is lick that neighbor's face and they'll regurgitate some of theirs. So it's future, you're paying it forward, but you're gonna get a benefit of it eventually. And if somebody cheats you, everybody remembers the cheat and they won't give them food again and let them die. Right? Okay, and then our very last part was all about communication. So this is where an action done by one is influencing the behavior of the receiver. And we talked about different types of communication, and what were the different types of communication we could have? Chemical, okay, good. Chemical. What else? Visual. Okay, auditory. And what else? Tactile. Good job. Okay, so let's put day, night, or both. What about chemical? Day and night. What about visual? Usually it's in the day. What about auditory? Day and night. And what about tactile? Day and night. Okay. What is going to be the faster ones of these? Yeah, auditory is going to be fast. Who else is going to be fast?
Visual.
Visual is going to be fast. So chemical is going to be a little slower because you have to wait for that chemical to dissipate.
Okay.
Tactile, that can be fast, right? Because you're touching somebody, but you have to be, it's fast, but you have to be close, right? In order to make it happen.
Okay.
Fast and close.
Because if you scream, you don't have to be necessarily
Yeah, you don't have
close.
to. Hi, sweetheart. How are you?
Good, you?
Good. I'm just right in the middle of a
Okay.
review.
Okay.
So, you have to be fast and you have to be close for tactile. And then, the other thing is we want to remember key words that we had with each. So do you remember in chemical there was a word for, yes, pheromones. Okay.
I realized you did another one of the drives.
Yes,
didn't you?
I did. Yes, I did. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Good. So sorry, I'm recording this. So pheromone is a chemical signal that says, come hither, come hither, come hither, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to see you, sweetheart.
Good to see you.
Okay. And then visual, we said usually day. What was an example in visual that we, go ahead.
For pheromone,
Mm-hmm.
is it saying come or is it saying this is my territory?
Oh, pheromones are usually like sexual, come here. But you
Okay.
could also use chemicals to mark a territory too. But
Okay.
pheromones are usually reserved for the sexual end of it. Usually reserved for that. Okay, or usually referencing that in your endocrine
Okay.
system
Okay.
and I'm ready to mate. Visual, what was an example of a visual signal?
Colorful.
Colors, yes, any kind of dance would be a visual signal, right? Okay.
Okay.
Most dances by birds, just not the bee dance. Okay, and the bee dance, remember, was under tactile, right?
Okay.
And do you remember what we called that? The what dance? Yeah, waggle dance. Okay, and in that one we know that the direction in which it waggles, that when you go out of the nest, that same angle, remember straight up would be fly towards the sun, and then whatever angle that you do your dance in, that's the direction away from the sun. And then the number of waggles tells you what it is.
How far it is.
How far it is, good. And then auditory, we talked about making calls and making sounds, We looked at howler monkeys and birds, right? You could look at dogs and barking. I think you wouldn't have any trouble identifying what kind of
Yeah.
communication. And then the other thing I want to say is that sometimes, you know, these are gonna happen in tandem. You're gonna get auditory and visual, and when you do that at the same time, it becomes very specific to your species, because it's a combination of those 2 or 3 or 4 signals that are all happening together. Okay, we good? Now that's the content. If you want, I can go through and hit each of the clicker questions, and you can just see if you know them. You don't have to actually click them in.
Yeah,
Okay.
I did ground one.
Okay, so if we, here's one here. Egg-laying hormone causes snails to lay eggs, implicating which system in this behavior?
Endocrine.
Endocrine system, yep, would be the endocrine system. All right, you guys want me to go over that at all, or are you comfortable?
Comfortable.
Comfortable, okay. And then on this question, using treats to train a dog to do a trick is an example of, what would that one be? Operant, good. And you're gonna remember that because why?
Because you're rewarding it for doing
After the operation,
Operation.
after you perform the behavior.
Yeah.
If I had to potty train any one of you, okay, and I said, if you go potty and then you get M&Ms, that would be what? Operant
Operant.
conditioning, because you have to do this first and then I will follow it up with a treat. Okay? There was just one, there was just one question here. And the big thing here is it says the costs that you have to pay if you're the dominant male baboon. What were the costs that we said you had to pay? You had to be more food, because you are big,
bigger.
and what? More injuries, because you have to, yeah, so you're more prone to injury and you require more food. If you want to snap that, there it is. Did you want- okay. Okay, and so behavior related to defending a particular area. So if I'm defending a particular area, which one would that be? I'm defending an area for feeding and mating and caring for my young.
Territoriality.
Yes, territoriality, good job. That's why, that's what you would call that term. All right, chemical substance secreted into an environment by one organism that influences the behavior of another. Pheromone, good. Okay, so social interaction that benefits others but has the potential to decrease the lifetime reproductive success of a member exhibiting that behavior. What would that be? Yep, altruism. I'm decreasing my reproductive success. That would be altruism.
For most other animals, is it only about really reproductive success?
Yeah, your fitness, it's basically sacrificing your life for someone else.
Okay.
Okay? All right, and then signals sent by a sender that may influence the behavior of a receiver. What is that? That's straight up communication, right? That's just the definition of communication. Okay, and then on this one I said put them in the following order. So the bee dance would be an example of what? Tactile, so that's what, 4. Okay, the aphids releasing an alarm pheromone, that would be chemical, 1. Ground squirrels giving an alarm call to warn others would be auditory. Male peacocks exhibiting an elaborate display, visual. Good. And that was it. Okay, do you feel like you got a good rundown?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, make good choices, and you guys don't forget to study for your quiz tomorrow and do your additional objectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, yeah.
additional
Really
objectives.
pulleys. I don't know.
We could do the lab map on a separate paper.
Yes, and then you can put it in, yeah, later.
Do we not have to do the